Polygamy has been a growing trend in many countries throughout the world and even in the United States. So, in today's episode, we're going to take a biblical look at polygamy and we're going to answer two questions. One, does God condone polygamy? And two, why doesn't God speak out against polygamy if he is against it? And then three, we're going to look at some startling statistics about the practice of polygamy today. So, number one, does God condone polygamy? And to answer that question, we really need to go back to the beginning and take a look at first mentions and biblical examples as we scan through the scriptures.
So in Genesis 2:24, after God took a rib from Adam and created woman, he defined what marriage is. In verse 24, he says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." So God's original definition and design for marriage, we see right in Scripture, is one man with one wife. And God goes on to say that the two shall become one. Not three, not four, not five, but one. The two will become one.
And I love that because right from the start in God's first mention of marriage, where he gives us his design and his definition of marriage, it is to be one man and one woman, period. And then we move forward in history and we find in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, Cain married one wife. And in Genesis 7:7, it tells us that Noah also had one wife.
In fact, in 1 Peter 3:20 confirms that there were 8 people in the ark, Noah and his wife and their 3 sons, and each of them had one wife.
And in Genesis 4:19, we find the very first mention of polygamy. And it was a man named Lamech. He was a man who had killed 2 men. And he's the first one that we read in Scripture married to 2 women. But it's interesting because he was like trying to say, well, Cain was protected, so you need to protect me from my dastardly deed. And then there was Abraham. He was the second man to have more than one wife. And in Genesis chapter 16, verse 1, Sarai prompted Abraham to take Hagar to basically become a surrogate who would help bear a child for Abraham and Sarai. And for some unknown reason, Abraham agreed. And we know what kind of crazy drama that caused for really everyone involved.
Yeah, and ultimately, all throughout history, the descendants of those 2 brothers, Ishmael and Isaac, they have been at war ever since.
They have. And in Genesis chapter 17, verses 18 and 19, God told Abraham that his covenant would be established through his son with his wife, Sarah. And it's interesting because we know that God's intentional, and he intentionally did not mention Hagar as Abraham's wife. Hagar was really always referred to as the servant, Hagar. Sarah was the one, or Sarai was the one who was always referred to as Abraham's wife.
Yeah, and there's some things that are very important to note. Number one, in Genesis 22, 1 through 16, God calls Isaac, Abraham's son, his only son.
Yes, and in Genesis chapter 24, Isaac had one wife, Rebekah. And Rebekah and Isaac have Jacob and Esau. So in Genesis chapter 26, verses 34 through 35, Esau became rebellious after Isaac had blessed Jacob instead of him. And one of the ways in which he rebelled against his family was that he became a polygamist. He ended up marrying several wives.
Yeah, and Jacob's parents instructed him to marry a wife, not multiple wives. In Genesis 28, 1 and 2, it says, "Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said, 'You shall not take a wife, singular, from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife, singular, from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother.'" So in Genesis 29, Jacob sets his sights on marrying Rachel, and unfortunately, Rachel's dad, Laban, tricked him into marrying his sister Leah, but Jacob still loved Rachel. So rather than just settling for Leah, such a sad story to me, Jacob worked for 6 more years for the right to marry her, and then he does.
Right. So Jacob became a polygamist, but his marriages became a great example to all of us as to why polygamy is so unhealthy and so contrary to what marriage is supposed to be about and really to represent. You know, Rachel and Leah, they consistently competed for Jacob's love. Leah constantly hoped that with each child that she would have, that maybe, just maybe, Jacob would finally love her. They even bartered mandrakes for bed rights to be able to sleep with Jacob. And so talk about a really dysfunctional family.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it is such a very twisted and emotionally devastating situation for all of them. In polygamous marriages, women are like subservient to the man. They often compete with one another for love, for sleeping rights. They deal with a lot of emotional hurt, heartache, insecurity. And the man is like the king of the mountain, like everything revolves around him, which is contrary to biblical marriage in pretty much every way.
It is. But we do need to acknowledge that there are many well-noted men in Scripture who had multiple wives. And
True.
God used many of them tremendously. David, Solomon, Gideon, Joash, just to name a few. But we need to be careful to remember that just because the Bible mentions something that people did, it doesn't mean that God condones it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we know this because in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, it tells us that God's standards for those who would be king of Israel, like David and Solomon, it was that he shall not acquire multiple wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away from God. So obviously, many of the kings didn't listen to God's instructions that were found in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, nor did they marry in accordance with God's original design and his intent. So the commands, when you think about this, the commands for a king not to have multiple wives was important. One, I think the example that they set, because if he wasn't to marry more than one wife as the king, then other men of the nation should not have multiple wives either.
Right, right. Now, this is encouraging, though. Now, Joseph, who was the second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt, he could have had multiple wives, but instead he chose to follow God's original design, and he only married one wife. Yay, Joseph.
Go, Joseph. So that's some of the Old Testament foundation on polygamy for us for right now. So now let's look at the New Testament. And in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 10, the Pharisees, they come to Jesus. They're trying to test him, and they're asking him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Now, note that even in their question, they didn't say if a husband was to divorce one of his wives. It was singular, one husband, one wife. But listen carefully to how Jesus responded. And then we're going to kind of examine this passage along the way as we go. It says this, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? So they were created to be the first human married couple as a male and a female, not male and females. Then verse 5 goes on to say, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. Again, the man singular is to join the wife singular, and the two shall be one flesh. We read this everywhere in Scripture. So we see this original design of marriage as described and mandated by God in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. There are no multiple marriages even hinted at in Scripture.
Yeah, I mean, that's really pretty super clear that God's original design for marriage was one man and one woman, and Jesus mandates it right here in Matthew when he's questioned about marriage and divorce. In verse 6, then Jesus goes on and he reiterates the oneness of the two. He says, so then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus took them all the way back to Genesis and God's original definition and design of marriage. It was one man, one woman, and the two were to become one.
And then in verse 7 continues, and they said to him, why then, I love this, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her, singular, away? He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce, but from the beginning it was not so. You know, divorce wasn't God's original intent, just like polygamy was not God's original intent. Then Jesus goes on and addresses her question about divorce. And in verse 9, he says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, singular, not one of many wives, whoever divorces her, except for sexual immorality, and then marries another, commits adultery. So even divorcing a wife and marrying another is committing adultery, which means if you're married and you sleep with or you marry someone else, you're committing adultery. So Jesus taught that monogamy, one husband, one wife, was a biblical standard for marriage.
And then 1 Corinthians 7 says, where Paul is addressing how to respond to an unbelieving spouse, every reference is to a singular husband and a singular wife. 1 Timothy 3:2 and 12 and Titus 1:6, it requires that a man who's a pastor or a church leader is to be the husband of one wife, not multiple wives. He's to be a one-woman man who's life and marriage lines up with God's original intent and design for marriage. And while these passages refer specifically to church leadership, the specifications actually describe what the life of a Christian should look like. Blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, ruling their children and their own house as well, not accused of dissipation, which is excess, immorality, impurity, and rebellious. So these are all distinctions of the Christian life. And since we are all called to be set apart and to live holy lives, these apply to us as well.
Yeah, they do. And last week, we were in the Bible study group, and one of the ladies asked, because we were talking about the subject of polygamy, which is why we're doing this episode, by the way. But she asked, if God isn't against polygamy, why doesn't he not call them out about it or speak out against it? So that's the second question that we're going to answer today. Why doesn't God speak out against polygamy if he is against it? So I think about it much like slavery. God dealt with people where they were, and sometimes he spoke to the cultural trends of the day, the things that the people were involved in, but he didn't always speak out against them. So we look at verses like Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 through 17, and we read God responding to those who chose to ignore his original plan for marriage and decided to marry more than one wife. And here's what it reads. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and they have borne him children, both the loved and the unloved, and the firstborn son is of her who is unloved, then it shall be on the day that he bequeaths his possessions to his sons that he must not bestow firstborn status on the son of the loved wife in preference to the son of the unloved, the true firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his.
Yeah, let's talk about this, because after reading that, someone might say, well, see, he's for polygamy, because if he was against it, why wouldn't he just tell him to stop? I think that's a really great question to explore.
And a lot of people have that question. I think about like this as a mom. So if I tell my children, you are to only marry believers. When you get married, marry a believer. But if they choose not to do so, then at that point, I really have to meet them where they are, right? I mean,
yeah.
And we think about God. I mean, ultimately, God is God. And for reasons that we don't and can't understand, he has chosen to deal with several cultural issues like that. Like I said, slavery. But he also has stated what his perfect will is. And he also knows that we're flesh. And as scripture says, we're prone to do what is right in our own eyes. So basically, he deals with us where we are, knowing he's given us free will.
Well, yeah. And I guess that's pretty much how he speaks in scripture regarding slavery, or the lack of what he says to us regarding, like step families. Kind of like, I've told you what you're supposed to do, but if you're going to do your own way, then this is how you need to handle it. This is an important rule to remember when we're reading scripture. Don't mistake God's permissive will with his perfect will, and don't mistake what God allows with what God decrees. I mean, just because God allows something, it does not mean that it's his will that we do it. So before we look into some really startling statistics, let's bottom line all of this, okay? Did God allow polygamy? Yes, he clearly did. Did God ordain polygamy? No, he clearly did not. Did he speak against it? No, he didn't. But yes, he actually did. When he defined and designed marriage, that was speaking against anything other than his plan.
And we were talking earlier, Rebecca, about how devastating it is. I mean, far too many women and children and families have been devastated by polygamous marriages, and they aren't healthy on so many different levels. I mean, we were talking earlier about what if you were one of the wives, how would you feel?
I mean, I can't even imagine that. I think I would have to totally just forget anything I ever learned about marriage, because otherwise I would die. I'd be dead inside.
Well, and it would be so destructive, because you remember we were reading about the unloved wife and the loved wife. Like at some point, if you feel like, oh, I'm the loved wife, well, that's unhealthy. And if you're feeling like you're the loved wife, at some point, if he pays any attention to another wife, you're going to feel like the unloved wife.
Absolutely.
And you'd always be battling these emotions of insecurities and
so unstable. It would be terrible.
You would never understand your value.
For sure.
It's heartbreaking to think about what women go through in polygamous marriages and why God gave us the instructions in the first place.
Right.
He knows best what's best for us.
That's right. Absolutely.
And so as a woman, I think we could understand why we don't think that would be healthy and why,
Right.
It's not healthy. And biblically, we've actually shown from Scripture why the polygamous marriages are not God's will. So now we're going to move on to some interesting tidbits on polygamy and the startling statistics about polygamy today. Polygamy is actually an umbrella term for a spouse marrying multiple spouses. And the practice of polygamy is kind of divided into three different types. One, polygyny, and it's the most common, where a man marries multiple wives. Then there's polyandry, which is, and I'm not sure I'm saying it right, but it's rare because it's women who marry multiple husbands. And then there's polyamorous, which is kind of open marriages where you have like a woman could be married, have a boyfriend, and go sleep around with other people. It's just an open marriage circumstance. It's really messy. And
I mean,
unhealthy.
this is really shocking to me. But polygamy, it's sad that it's on the rise worldwide. I mean, many cultures and religions maintain that polygamy is not only a marital option, but it's actually a preference. The stats in the sub-Sahara Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East are rising more quickly than anywhere else. From 2000 to 2020, they went up over 200%, and they're expected to go up more, 141% in the next 15 years.
That is so crazy.
Yeah.
And the highest incidences of polygamous marriages are in Europe and Central Asia. And even though polygamy is federally outlawed in the United States, North America has the second highest rate of polygamous marriages under Europe and Asia.
What? So this is a real issue, and the statistics are tracking in an upward trend.
And many people practice polygamy under what is known as the levirate marriage. And this was the Jewish custom, which we find in Scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, where it talks about when a married man dies and he has brothers. One of his brothers is to step up to the plate and carry on the deceased brother's line by marrying his wife, and to care for that wife so that she's not abandoned, so she doesn't have to fend for herself. And, in Israel, they formally outlawed it in 1977. There are some fringe Orthodox groups which still practice it, and there are some chief rabbis who will approve polygamous marriages or levirate marriages for specific reasons.
Well, there you have it. Does God condone polygamy? No. There are several other verses we could cover, but hopefully this will answer your questions about polygamy and why God doesn't come out and just say, thou shalt not, against it.
Yeah. And I found some really great resources online. Mike Winger has some great info on his YouTube channel. And so does Alan Parr at The Beat, as well as Got Questions Ministries. And so we'll have links below for you so that you can pop over and check those out for yourself.
Yeah. And before we go, there's a verse that reminds us that all that we do should be done through the lens of Scripture. And it's found in 1 Corinthians 10:31, which says, therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Until next time, never stop asking, what's the Bible say?